Let's examine, shall we, the fascinating spectacle of two conservative leaders engaged in what scholars might term a public policy disagreement, but what the rest of us would recognize as throwing each other under the climate-neutral bus.
Making promises and not delivering is exactly the reason that the political class has lost trust. The only way that we can regain it is to tell the unvarnished truth. Net zero by 2050 is impossible. I don't say that with pleasure.
Ms. BADENOCH has discovered impossibility. How fascinating that this revelation comes not during her time as business secretary, when she was quite enthusiastically championing net zero, but now when she's seeking to differentiate herself as the conservative opposition leader. One might be forgiven for thinking that the laws of physics and economic reality have somehow fundamentally altered since she left government.
Even where there is a plan, we are behind. Let's look at one easy example. By 2040, the Committee on Climate Change says more than half of UK homes need to rip out their boilers and replace them with a heat pump.
Here we witness what academics call selective data framing. Ms. BADENOCH focuses on heat pump installation rates, currently at 50,000 annually, to suggest the 2050 target is unattainable. Yet curiously absent from her analysis is any mention of accelerating adoption curves or technology improvements. It's rather like suggesting in 1995 that the internet would never catch on because dial-up was too slow.
We are massively exposing ourselves to countries who do not share our values. Take solar panels. The good news is that costs have dropped in the last decade. Here's the less good news. 10 years ago, we were heavily dependent on China for all of the key components. Today, we're even more dependent. Look at the top dozen makers of solar panels. They are nearly all Chinese.
Historically speaking, dependency concerns have a curious way of materializing precisely when they align with one's preferred policy direction. When we needed Russian gas, such dependencies were manageable risks. When we need Chinese solar panels, they become existential threats. The consistency is remarkable.
Why is it 2050 in the first place? No one knows. This is one of the things that we have got to fix, just simply making announcements without plans. So at some point, we will come out with new policies, but it may be that there's a better way of delivering net zero. Or it may be that we shouldn't be looking at net zero, but just focusing on clean energy and energy security. And there's a different way of doing that.
I must pause here to appreciate the extraordinary political maneuvering. In the span of one sentence, Ms. BADENOCH has managed to simultaneously claim she has a plan, state she doesn't yet have a plan, and suggest she might abandon the concept altogether. This is what we in political economics call having one's carbon cake and eating it too. Meanwhile, Baroness May, who, let us remember, enshrined the 2050 target into law without the detailed implementation plan Ms. BADENOCH now laments, has responded with what appears to be genuine surprise that her successor might question her legacy. Net zero by 2050 is challenging but achievable, says the former Prime Minister, in what scholars might characterize as a technically accurate but practically unhelpful observation. It is indeed achievable in the same way that my cat Sovi could, theoretically, learn to file my tax returns. Possible, but requiring a rather optimistic view of both capability and motivation.
Diagnosing the real problems, finding workable solutions, building a proper plan, then being ready to rebuild and make our country stronger again.
What's particularly illuminating is the business community's reaction. The CBI, not typically known as an environmental radical organization, has pointed out that the net zero economy grew by 10% last year. It seems capitalism has already begun adapting, while politicians are still debating whether adaptation is possible. The irony here is substantial. Ms. BADENOCH criticizes the lack of a detailed plan for net zero while offering none of her own. She warns of economic devastation while business leaders warn her position threatens economic opportunities. She champions realism while floating policy positions that appear to shift with political winds. Let's put this in perspective. Climate policy has become the perfect political football, kicked around enthusiastically by all sides, subject to constant rule changes and seemingly impossible to get into the net. I'm Dr. Marcus Pemberton, and as always, I'm terribly sorry to have to tell you this.